Compañeros, welcome to the SQL Data Partners podcast, the podcast dedicated to SQL Server-related topics, which is designed to help you become familiar with what's out there, how you might use those features, or ideas on how you might apply them in your environments. I am Carlos L. Chacon.
And I am Steve Stedman. We are two data professionals trying to help others get a better handle on their database environments, either through this podcast, our training, or our consulting practice. Thanks for joining us on the SQL Trail. Welcome to the show.
SQL Data Partners.
Okay, compañeros, welcome to episode 87. Another great episode in store today. Hello, Steve.
Hey, Carlos. Yes, this is certainly going to be an interesting episode. Our topic today is on tSQLt.
Right. So in part, we reached out to Sebastian. Sebastian Meine's our guest, and he is ultimately the author of the tSQLt framework. And we reached out to him in part because Eric Rangel asked, after our episode with Lynn on doing automated testing in the BI subspace, if people were using open source tools such as tSQLt to do some of this testing. And while admittedly we don't necessarily get quite to that question per se, Sebastian does give us some examples and some scenarios on how you can use it and why you'd want to use it.
And on that topic, the link to our show notes this week is sqldatapartners.com/tSQLt.
Yes, we've got a couple of shout outs today. We want to give a shout out to Raul Gonzalez. There was a conversation between he and Argenis, and had done a post on the disk speed testing. And Argenis kind of pinged him and said, hey, you need to take a peek at episode 75, where we talked with Argenis about how we test our storage. And Raul's comment was, just finished listening to the episode, and that explains that why when I test another LUN, I get 450 megabytes a second, but then when I write backups, I only get 250 megabytes a second.
Yep.
And so I think it helped him get another perspective on how he could go about doing some of his testing.
And that episode had a lot of great information on I/O and SAN storage and all that. So
that's right.
Definitely a good episode to jump back to if you missed it.
That's right.
Another shout out we have this week is from Michael in regard to Database Health Monitor. And his comment was outstanding. Besides enjoying the layout of your app, one thing I really like about the Quick Scan report is each entry has a corresponding link that discusses the findings, so I can go back and review recommendations, cautions, etc. So thank you, Michael.
Yes. I do find those links to be super helpful because you want to try to cram a lot of information in there, but then it just becomes cluttered, right? And then so if you see something that you think is of interest to you, it allows you to go and then find out more about that and get more detail.
Yep.
Our last shout out is to Bill Morrow. Bill Morrow was talking about episode 83 with data visualizations. He said, great episode. Jonathan Stewart thinks on another level. So we agree, Bill, and we were happy to have Jonathan on the program.
Yeah, I think that was a real fun episode with Jonathan that week. So
yeah, that's right. Okay, I think it's time for a little SQL Server in the news.
Okay, breaking news with SQL Server. From the Microsoft SQL Server blog site, they've just announced SQL Server Premium Assurance, providing 6 more years of product support.
Wow.
So 6 more years. That means a total of 16 years of product support on SQL Server versions 2008 and newer. So
right.
I don't think in 2024, 7 years from now, that I'm going to be too excited about running SQL Server 2008.
Or supporting it.
Yeah, that would be a lot like running SQL Server 2000 today.
Yeah, I agree. And now you've gone to the whole vNext, idea. Of course, a lot of that emphasis has been on Linux, but at a minimum, they've gone to the 2-year release cycles, right? How many versions of SQL Server are we going to have between now and then?
Yep.
So it'll be interesting.
So one comment that they have in the post is it says you can get the lowest pricing and lock-in savings if you purchase through June of 2017, and prices will increase over time, so act now. Who knows exactly what that means, how much they'll increase, but I have a feeling that in 2023 and 2024, it's going to be expensive to get that for SQL Server. To get that for SQL Server 2008.
No, and rightfully so, right? Because I think if we're called in to support a couple of those environments, it'd be pretty expensive, I think.
Yep.
The other item of news in episode 66, we had Graham Malcolm on the program talking about the professional program that Microsoft had released. They were focused, that course was the data science, was the first one they released. I followed back up with him, and he mentioned that this summer, into the summer of 2017, they're going to be releasing a big data course. Now, many of the individual lessons, if you will, are already available on edX. So at edX.org/school/Microsoft, you can check out lessons that would include HD Insight, Azure Data Lake, Azure Stream Analytics, Azure Data Factory. All the love that analytics is getting now, course at the professional program this summer.
Wow, good stuff.
That's right.
Other items in the news. This is more our news than SQL Server news, but the Database Health Monitor, I just came out with the latest update of that. The March 2017 release was released last Friday on March 3rd, and it's now available, and a couple new features and building on the February release with a couple more things and getting a lot of good feedback on it at this point. So if you haven't tried it out, I'd love to get your feedback. Try it out at databasehealthmonitor.com/download. And it's free to try out and free to use. So let me know what you think.
That's right. And with that, we've actually included a link to a survey. That's another way for you to give us some feedback on what you like about it, what you'd like to see improved, things like that.
Yep. And we also have a new support system with it. So if you are in Database Health Monitor and you say report a bug or request a feature, it links off to a new support. And you say report a bug or request a feature, it links off to a new support site we have that notifies us as soon as anyone puts in a request, and then gives us the ability to get in and follow up on it quicker.
Very cool.
That way we're not just losing those comments in my inbox.
Yeah, that's right. That's always nice.
Yep.
Okay, so I think let's go ahead and jump into the conversation with Sebastian. Well, Sebastian, welcome to the program.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
I think we have some interesting things to talk about, and not only a technology, but how you decided to go ahead and put this together. So I guess first, our subject is tSQLt. So why don't you give us the nickel tour here on how you explain to somebody what tSQLt framework is?
The tSQLt framework, that is a unit testing framework for SQL Server. And what I mean with that is it really means you go down to the smallest unit of code in SQL Server. That would be stored procedures or functions or views, and you write tests for them in isolation. And tSQLt offers a lot of functionality around that makes particular the testing in isolation easier.
Can you give an example there of a way that someone might create a unit test around a stored procedure, for example?
Well, how detailed do you want me to get this early on?
Yeah.
Maybe we could take a little bit different approach there at a higher level of like around test-driven development. One of the things that I've seen with that is the sort of strategy of you first create a failing unit test, and then you write your code to pass. And then you write another test and you write the code to pass that test. Is that what people are doing with
test-driven development? And I have to prefix that with I love it.
Okay.
Test-driven development has a bad reputation out there. A lot of people think it's scary and it takes too much work, and we can talk about that a little later. But yes, tSQLt allows you to do test-driven development, and in fact, tSQLt itself was developed, kind of bootstrapped using itself, completely test-driven. So important in test-driven development is that you take a really small piece of functionality, you write a test that shows you that that functionality isn't there, and then you implement the functionality, and then you run the test again, and it hopefully shows you now that the functionality is there. And that really does a few things. First, writing the test first, making sure that it fails, any language to write a test that doesn't really test anything, a test that can fail. So by writing that test first, you have the assurance that you have written your test correctly. And then by implementing just minimal amount of code required to make that test pass, you end up with very modular code, which in turn is really easy to maintain. And you have the tests that tell you if everything is still working.
Okay, so you'll forgive me, right? So being a little bit of a knuckle dragger that I am, it makes sense to me that you could, a piece of functionality is not there and you want to test for it. So let's just say I'm adding a parameter, right? Or I'm adding another column that gets returned or something like that, right? Okay, that seems fairly straightforward.
Yes.
Am I using this also to test the results or to interrogate what gets returned from a stored procedure, or also to test the results or to interrogate what gets returned from a stored procedure or from a view as well? Or is this just limited to the object itself?
Let's talk about the view. So okay. I have a view and I want that view to return some aggregated data. So I might have a count column and a sum column, let's say.
Okay, right.
So tSQLt allows you to compare result sets. It compares tables, not result sets, so the content of tables. So what you do is you insert your result set into one table, and then you insert the expected result into another table, and then you use assert equals table to compare the two tables, and it will tell you if there is a difference or if they are equal.
Okay, so then in that case, you would know, based off of the contents of the table that would be, for instance, being inserted from a view, if the view was producing the right results or the wrong results.
Correct.
Based off of comparing that to a known expected outcome. Is that
correct?
Yep. Okay.
And when starting out, in general, I recommend that you follow test case heuristics when you write your test cases. And for testing result sets, or for sets in general, you want to follow the 0-1 sum heuristic. So you start out with zero rows in the table that the view is accessing, and make sure that the view is returning the right thing. So say you're starting from scratch, you haven't written the view yet. The first thing you would do is you write the view that contains a select column, say the sum column from the view, and put that into, I tend to use temporary tables, into a temp table. Mm-hmm. And now the view isn't there. The table that the view is accessing, we assume that is there already. The view isn't there yet, so when you compile that stored procedure, you get a warning. And then if you run the test case, you get an error that the view isn't there. That's your first, call to action to now implement the view.
Okay.
Now, what the test at this point is asking for is that the view has one column called sum, or probably a little more expressive than sum.
Sure.
And the test case is accessing the view with a name. So the view has a name. The two things that are required at this point. So you implement the view. You don't have any logic at this point because the test isn't asking for anything yet. So you might just return a hard-coded empty result set that has
okay, so then once you've done that, you've confirmed that the zero case, that if there's 0 rows returned, that you're getting back the empty set that you were expecting.
At this particular example, I guess you shouldn't make up examples on the fly. Sum is an aggregate, so you will get 1 row back. In this case, we would expect a 0 in the sum or the count column if the input is empty.
Right.
That is, by the way, another thing that test-driven development is really good at. It makes you think through your requirements. So you catch something like this early on. Whereas often this particular case, do you want no row to be returned or do you want a 0 to be returned, goes unthought of. And then the result is whatever it is, but it might not match what the stakeholder actually requested.
Okay, so then once you've got the zero row situation figured out, I assume you move into the one row.
Correct. 0, 1 sum. So the next test is a one row. So you write a new test case. You insert one row into the base table. Then you expect the sum column to return the value that is in that row, in the column that we are looking at.
So then you would have what was the assert method that you mentioned that compares the tables? So
assert equals table.
Okay, so assert equals table would make sure that your two tables are the same.
Yeah.
For your one row, and then I assume you would just continue on with that for more than one row.
The sum rows, yes. And sum really means stick with a few. I usually recommend 3 or so. I rarely run into a case where you really need more than 10 rows. And important to note here is unit testing is not performance testing.
Sure.
Not possible. In fact, you want to run all your test cases every time you make a change. The only way that is going to happen, because we all are impatient and lazy, is if executing a test case is easy and fast.
Right. We had that same recommendation in episode 72 with Lynn. We were talking about test automation for data warehouses.
Yeah.
That was kind of her thing, is like find a representative sample, right? You don't need the whole database. Find your sample, a couple of customers that you could work with, and start there. I guess it sounds like you're kind of saying the same thing.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So then one of the next questions that we had was around who is using this. And we're not really looking for specific company names there. What we're looking for is like what type of people or what type of roles are the people? Are they software developers, or are they DBAs or testers, or who's really looking for is like what type of people or what type of roles are the people? Are they software developers, or are they DBAs or testers, or who's really using the product and getting the most value out of it?
Anybody who is writing SQL modules should be using it. And I don't have company names, so I couldn't even answer that. But anybody who earns a living with writing SQL modules should test those modules. And while I'm extremely biased, I would say tSQLt is the best way to do that.
A good example of that, I was working on a stored procedure for a client recently where after the 1st of January, it behaved differently than it did in the months that were near the end of the year. And after seeing the problems that we ran into there because of somebody doing month addition or subtraction,
yes,
it would have been really nice to have a tSQLt test case for that so that we could have had a run through and done extensive testing there beyond what had originally been done with it. That's something that I can think would be a great use for it.
Yeah, it's a boundary condition. If you're crossing from one month into another one, there's a heuristic for that too. You want to make sure that code is behaving correctly at those boundaries. And following test-driven development and using heuristics would have caught that problem most likely before it actually became a problem.
Okay, so if somebody's listening and they think, I want to give this a try, where would you recommend would be a good place to get started, or steps to follow, or where to learn about just how do you jump in and start using tSQLt?
Well, it's called tSQLt, and the website for it is tSQLt.org. It is open source, so you can just go there, download it, and start playing with it. And that's also a complete functional manual. Well, almost complete. There are a few functions that I haven't gotten around documenting yet.
Yep. Okay.
So even more than I think, just to jump in a little further there, is you made the case that, gosh, if I had unit tested this, I could have avoided problems down the line. But it's almost a mentality shift, because just to use that example, I have a stored procedure that needs a view. Well, I'm going to be thinking, okay, well, let's see, what does my view need to have so that I can feed this procedure? And it sounds like, well, I need to reassess what it is that I'm asking, or what it is that my requirements are. How do you begin that mind shift to say, okay, instead of just jumping in and creating the view, let me think about how I could set up these use cases, or what questions I need to ask myself to get them set up. Does that make sense?
That makes sense, yeah. So automated unit testing is a complete mind shift. And it is hard for people to get used to. But once you have done it a little bit regularly, it's not actually hard. It's scary at first, but you get used to it fairly quickly.
You can tell where I fall into my automated unit testing practice.
Yeah, just think about what does this view need to do for me, and then pick the thing that seems easiest for you right now to write a test for that asks for that functionality, and then write the test and then implement the functionality. And then pick the next thing.
I know I've seen at a couple of SQL Saturdays, I've seen Steve Jones with Redgate present on tSQLt and the Redgate tools that integrate with it. Can you maybe share with us what T and the Redgate tools that integrate with it? Can you maybe share with us what part of that is the Redgate products versus what part of it is the tSQLt framework?
So Redgate provides an easy button. tSQLt is a bunch of SQL scripts, and to write your test cases, you write stored procedures that follow a naming convention. Actually, you need to create, I call a test class first. The reason I call it test class is because that's the naming convention that the JUnit framework, the first unit testing framework, put in place, and tSQLt is following the JUnit convention. So a test class is really a schema that has been marked by the framework as a schema that contains test cases. And then to mark the test case stored procedures within that schema, you just need to start their name with the first test. That allows you to put other helper stored procedures in that same schema. That makes it very flexible, even though a naming convention seems rigid at first. So to execute your test cases, you have to run the stored procedure tSQLt run, or tSQLt run all. Run all runs all test cases in the database. A run takes parameters, what you specify what you want to run. And that can be at times a little cumbersome, that you have to actually call that stored procedure. What Redgate did is they provided a plugin for Management Studio that makes that easy to execute test cases. You just have to select the test case you want to run and click the run button. And so it's a nice GUI on top of tSQLt. And I have to say, Redgate isn't alone anymore. There are now, I think, three other vendors that offer similar functionality. But Redgate was the first.
Oh, interesting. No, so you'd mentioned the documentation. Is there an example? I mean, again, right, knuckle dragger that I am, it would be helpful for me to see some examples of like, okay, here's a view, here's a procedure, and let's walk through that. You mentioned you had the procedures there to kind of get going. Are there good examples out there that people could reference to kind of get a handle on this?
Yeah, so there's the user guide, which is really the manual of the procedures, processes. But there's also a quick start guide on tSQLt.org, which is a very basic introduction into how to use the framework and into unit testing in general.
Very good. So
for the unit testing to work, is this something that the people using it need to have, like if it's developers sharing a database, that they need to have their own individual instance or database they're working with, or can multiple developers work against a shared database using tSQLt?
As a general best practice, you want to have your own development environment. And SQL Server Developer Edition now being free, there's really no reason anymore to not have your own development environment.
Very good point. Yeah.
The database code has to be, that's not even an option anymore, has to be in source control. And with that, it is easy to run, to install your own copy of the database.
So when you say it has to be in source control, does the tSQLt do something to integrate to pull things from source control, or?
No, tSQLt is only for testing. But Redgate has a nice plugin, Redgate Source Control, that even manages.
An open source project, is that something that you have other people contributing with, or is it currently just you, or where's that at?
So it started out with Dennis and me, and Dennis got lost somewhere on the way. So right now it is only me. And every once in a while I get somebody asking if they can help out, but they then disappear too, for whatever reason. So yes, I would love to have help on the project. And the project is on GitHub. You can find it there if you search for tSQLt. And I have been stretched a little thin over the last few months, so there has not been a lot of progress on tSQLt. I'm always doing a little bit, but I haven't actually put out a new version in a while.
Yeah, I'm seeing this. There are some issues, and it looks like people are contributing some issues.
People are now starting to ask for problems to be fixed.
With that, part of the beauty of GitHub and being open source is that when people ask for things to be fixed, they can also contribute.
Yes. And for a contribution to be accepted, it is important that it is well covered with tests.
That's a great point. Since it is the SQL testing tool, it would be silly for someone to submit a change or a feature that isn't well tested, right?
Correct. And you will be surprised what I sometimes get.
So one thing that jumped out that you said as part of the story there was, and I think you mentioned earlier, is that tSQLt or unit testing is not intended for performance work, but it seems like it's a great way when you're doing the performance work to know if you broke anything or if you're getting the right results.
Correct. Anytime you wanna or you have to change
the right results.
Correct. Anytime you wanna or you have to change your code, you want to be sure that you haven't broken anything. And have you ever been in that situation where you changed a little bit of code in a stored procedure because of a requirement change? Another feature that you thought was totally unrelated suddenly broke.
Oh, no, that never happens.
Oh, no, that never happens. Yeah. And unit testing is really good at showing you those scenarios while you still are in the code. So instead of hearing about it a month later, what did happen there? I don't remember. You get that feedback within a few minutes. So you still know what you just changed. And then you can easily understand, hopefully easily, the connection and figure out how to actually make it work. And that's really one of the things behind agile development that we haven't talked about yet, but unit testing is a part of that agile development mantra. Agile development is all about reducing the length of your feedback loops. So if something breaks, I want to hear about it as soon as possible. The longer it takes, the more time passes, the more the costs call it explode. The curve is actually exponential.
The risk increases of your ability to quickly resolve that.
Yeah.
And it's far cheaper to fix the bug that you find when you run your unit test than it is to fix the bug that a customer reports after you release the code.
Correct.
Yeah.
And far has like 3 zeros in that case.
So a lot of people like to pay lip service to that, and particularly organizations. And just what kind of numbers are you seeing from the tSQLt side? I mean, just from downloads. You've been working at this for a couple of years now, at least from the GitHub perspective.
It is still fairly low. I would like to add a 0 to the number of people that use it.
So we need a few more people to get in there.
Yes.
For me, I think there's still a pretty tall barrier to entry.
That's the thing with unit testing in general. Test-driven development in particular, but even if you just do unit testing, makes it a lot easier to maintain your code in the long run. Now, you spend about 80% of your time maintaining existing code and only 20%, if that, writing new code.
Sure.
So it makes sense to figure out a way to reduce the cost of maintenance. And if you have a good suite of test cases, it makes maintenance so much easier. And it actually makes you more likely to implement a change too, because you will know that it didn't break anything. So it reduces mental friction too, which is a big thing there. But anyway, to write that good suite of unit tests, that's a lot of work. So the actual writing the code becomes more expensive. The problem there is that cost is upfront. It's hard to get into developers' minds that it is really worth investing the time now because it will save your butt later. But it's also hard to get that into the management mind, because a feature that in the old way would have been, let's call it done, tomorrow is now going to take 3 or 4 days to be done. So management needs to buy in, and so 3 or 4 days to be done. So management needs to buy in, and it's also hard to get them to agree to it, because it's not going to take 1 day to finish the code, but it's now going to take 4 days. But the thing is, if you have the code done in 1 day and it breaks in a month from now when it is installed at the customer, you cannot really call it done in the first place.
Sure.
Right.
So, from my perspective, code is done if it is proven to be correct. And that's what you achieve with automated unit testing.
Sure. And oftentimes, though, when management buys in and says they want to be an agile company or business unit, they don't always buy into the extended time that it may take to make some of those things happen. And that's where the challenges come up.
Right.
That is correct, yeah. Management always has more than one first priority.
That is so true.
That's right. So should we go ahead and do the SQL family?
Sounds good.
All right. So Sebastian, can you share with us how you first got started with SQL Server?
Yeah, that was the same company. So when I was done with my PhD in Germany, the job market had just tanked. So I decided to try my luck in the US, and I ended up getting a job with a single phone call.
Wow.
That was luck. But the one thing that I told the guy in the interview was that I like programming, but I don't want to have anything to do with databases.
Yeah, and look at you now.
Right, the accent, the word "not" didn't quite come across.
To be fair, my first assignment was C++ code there, was working on the driver for those 128 stud procedures.
Wow.
But then at some point, the other team members said, maybe we should ask the PhD to help us with these performance issues. And that's how I got pulled into actually working on SQL Server. And somehow I learned liking it really quickly.
Very cool. Now, if you could change one thing about SQL Server, what would it be?
Yeah, a lot. What we really didn't talk about today yet is testing and isolation. And to test in isolation in other languages, you use things like test doubles, mock objects. Replacing in other languages, you use things like test doubles, mock objects. Replacements of the actual object that behave in an expected way, so that you can write your test around that. And tSQLt provides that functionality by providing fake tables and spy procedures and fake functions. And to make that work, I have to go really deep into the internals on SQL Server and do things that SQL was not written for. I would really love if that could be easier. For example, the feature that's the most requested right now that I haven't been able to implement completely yet is to deal with schema-bound objects.
Right. I noticed that in the request list.
So to get a schema-bound object replaced with a test double, I need to first replace a schema-bound object with a non-schema-bound object. So for that, I need to script out the object, which we know SQL Server has that functionality built in, but it doesn't make that accessible to tSQL code or even CLR code.
Oh, interesting.
So I have to hand code that scripting again. And while there are really not a lot of mistakes of bugs in tSQLt, the ones that keep sneaking in are things like I forgot to account for the scale in the new date time data type because I hadn't used it.
Gotcha.
And honestly, I shouldn't have to think about it because SQL Server should provide that functionality. And another thing that would be great if there would be a way to measure code coverage, which framework out there now that is doing something like code coverage based on extended events, but I would like to get that a lot more fine-grained, and that solution can
So
do.
you'll forgive me. What do you mean by code coverage?
Code coverage means if I have my code and I have a bunch of test cases,
Okay.
I want to be able to pinpoint the areas in the code that have not been covered by a test.
So for instance, a chunk
gotcha.
of dead code that's part of an if statement that's never being hit or something.
Part of an if statement likely will be hit in real life, but I have forgotten to write a test for it.
Right.
Which, if you follow test-driven development very closely, that will not happen. But most people don't, and then a code coverage tool becomes really handy.
What is the best piece of career advice that you've received?
Keep learning.
Mm-mm. Yeah.
Keep learning.
Mm-mm. Yeah. Never stops.
Never stop learning, yeah.
Sebastian, our last question for you today. If you could have one superhero power, what would it be and why do you want it?
Yeah. So there was this movie once, a very long time ago. It was about this robot number 5.
Short circuit.
Circuit.
Yes. So that goes back to keep learning. I love to read, and I suck at it. So I would really like to be able to read that fast.
Okay. Speed reader.
Yeah.
Very good. Well, Sebastian, thanks so much for being on the program today.
Thanks for having me.
Yep. Thanks a lot, Sebastian. I think this has been good.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I know we've had some conversation about tSQLt, and while I can't make any promises, so compañeros, all you guys out there, if you want to contribute or take a peek at Sebastian's framework, if we can add another 0 to his download numbers, I think it would be good for us, good for the community, good for SQL Server development in general.
I would really love to have somebody to help me with that.
Yeah, there we go. Okay, well, thanks again for coming on.
Thank you.
One thing that we didn't mention in the beginning that Sebastian told us, but we didn't include in the podcast was kind of how tSQLt framework came to be.
Right.
And this was some of work that he was doing in a hospital, and they were trying to do a conversion, or there was some project, right? They were trying to do some data migration, and they calculated how long it was going to take, and it ended up being like years
to validate and transfer the data.
Exactly. Yep. Years because of all of these, I guess, bad decisions that have been made, and eating the elephant one bite at a time. This need kind of created or produced the opportunity for them to work on a framework to break this process down and start testing it in smaller chunks. And then they would know that if they made a change, all of the it wouldn't affect their previous work.
Yep.
And so I thought that was kind of interesting and amazing, really, how a single person can kind of take a framework, and I guess I don't want to say or overstate it, but he does have several thousand downloads, and it's been integrated into products like the Redgate products. So I think I feel like it's safe to say that there's been some adoption of the framework, and I think it's impressive that he's kind of championed that all by himself, really.
Oh, yeah, just sort of a one-man show on that. I mean, it sounded like he could use some help, and he'd be interested in help if people were interested in helping, but it's pretty much been him most of the way. So
That's right. That's right.
very impressive most of the way. So
That's right. That's right.
very impressive.
Yeah, it reminds me. So we're going to be talking in a future episode. We'll be talking with the folks from DBA DBA Tools. There's a dbtools.io. And again, kind of now they have, I think, a larger team, but the way they've been able to put something out there that continues to be used and contributed to, all of those things, super, super impressive.
Yep. And that's correction on that. It's dbatools.io.
DBA Tools, okay.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, Chrissy Lemaire. And admittedly, I probably haven't gotten into the tSQLt framework as much as I wanted to. Me, the knuckle dragging Neanderthal that I am, and admittedly being a bit lazy. Now, Sebastian would say, no, you're putting more work on yourself because you're not going to implement these checks. I think that would be his rebuttal, right?
Yep.
But I agree that it seems like, right?
Yep.
But I agree that it seems like it's been a tall order to implement some of those things. But ultimately, I think he demonstrated that well worth the time and investment if you're serious about doing things in a rapid DevOps type environment.
Yep. And I know when I used it a couple of years ago, we used it through the Redgate integration piece, and I was very impressed with it. Certainly a pretty cool tool.
Yeah. That's right. So again, we'll have links to all of that on the show notes for today, which is at sqldatapartners.com/tSQLt. And and I guess we'd be interested to hear from you, compañeros, right? We got a couple of questions. Ultimately, Eric's question kind of prompted some of this discussion. Be interested to see how you guys are using tSQLt, what you like about it. Of course, Sebastian will be looking for some feedback. As Steve mentioned, he's looking for some help there as well. So if you're interested in contributing to a kind of a community project, be sure to reach out to him and
let us know. We'll see who we can track down to get you the podcast you want.
Yeah, that's right. That's one of the nice things about having the podcast is that people are very, very willing to come and chat with us and have these types of conversations, which has been great. And we've talked with people from all over the world, really. And so the SQL family is large, but it's not so large that we can't track down the people that we need to talk to.
Some of them take a while, but we usually get through to them eventually.
That's true. Some of them do take a while. And we have had a couple of no's, which is unfortunate, but it is what it is. Our music for SQL Server in the News is by Mansardian, used under Creative Commons. If you want to reach out to us, you can do so on our website at sqldatapartners.com/podcast, or you can do so on social media. I am on Twitter at Carlos L. Chacon.
And I'm on Twitter at SQLEMT. We'll see you on the SQL Trail.
SQL Data Partners.